Hey everyone, welcome back to the Athlete Climate Academy. I am super excited today to have Nick Muller with us, who's a professor of economics and engineering and public policy at the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University. That's an awful lot of things at an awful lot of places. Nick, welcome to the Athlete Climate Academy.
Thanks, it's a joy to be here.
I was going to say this off air, but I want to say it on air just for you. That is the professor of economics, engineering and public policy. I always say that the best things in science and engineering always happen at the intersection of lots of different disciplines. So I'm actually super stoked that you're a professor of all three of those, because you must have some interest in research.
Absolutely. So my research in particular focuses on using engineering models to track emissions of pollution from where they're produced across the countryside, ultimately to the people and communities that they impact. That takes engineering. I then use epidemiological or public health studies to estimate the impacts, and then I use economics to monetize those impacts into dollar units. And then finally, we can design public policies based on all that information to influence how we control or how we allocate that pollution. So all those are involved.
And I suppose that, when you talk about science and engineering and especially air pollution, like it takes those disciplines and the intersection of all of them, because it literally does touch everyone's lives. Like things like air pollution, it will touch everyone's lives because we all breathe the same air.
True. I mean, there's variation in how much air pollution there is according to where you live. But any air in the world is going to have some air pollution that was produced by human activity or economic activity. The air pollutants that we tend to pay most attention to from an economics point of view, from a policy point of view, are fine particulate matter, which is really, really small, much, much smaller than the diameter of a human hair, and tropospheric ozone. And both of those are associated with very serious health consequences that we now know after decades of epidemiological research.
So let's start right at the start about air pollution. How would you categorize it if you had to do an elevator pitch?
Sure. So one way to think about air pollution is, first of all, to note that there are hundreds of different air pollutant types, from toxins like benzene to visible things like soot that comes out of the back of a diesel bus or a diesel truck. As I said, the two that we pay most attention to from a public health point of view are tropospheric ozone, that's ground level ozone or smog, and the fine particles. Both of these are inhalable. They've been shown to cause health consequences ranging from upper respiratory symptoms and reduced productivity at work, all the way to awful things like premature mortality. And these are particularly, the premature mortalities are particularly concentrated among the elderly and folks that have pre-existing mortality risks, obesity, other conditions. And so this is a very inequitable consequence of air pollutants that are commonly distributed across lots of different populations and communities.
And, when you think of air pollution, I used to live, on the drive into my studio from my house. There's a valley that used to have a big coal-fired power station in it. And when I think of air pollution, I think coal-fired power stations. But obviously there's an infinite amount of ways, a lot of amount of ways that one can generate air pollution, not just from those big coal power stations.
Yeah, I mean you're spot on in the sense that the sort of classic image of air pollution itself is from whether it's a power station or a steel mill or some other kind of factory burning coal. And that still is true in many parts of the world, though in Western Europe and in the US, coal as a source of energy most broadly is on the decline. So there are still power stations that burn coal in various parts of the world. They are that classic image, but we now get most of our air pollution from transportation when we're burning gasoline or diesel as opposed to EVs. We get it from assorted industries, but we also get it from agriculture. when you think about all of the processes that are associated with raising animals for food or tilling soils to produce crops, there's a lot of air pollution that is produced in those production processes. In the US, our research shows that air pollution is now more harmful in aggregate than utilities or manufacturing is broad
Wow.
economic sectors. And that's, it's just an amazing sort of counterintuitive finding that that sector has risen in importance above what are probably the two most canonical or classical sources of air pollution that we think of historically.
And it's one of those things that is so intensely bound into climate change as well, like the literal deforestation, the slash and burning of whether that's in agriculture. Over in India, they've had a massive problem with that, with farmers in the north would burn big swaths of land, and that would slowly, all that smog, then all the smoke would slowly come down south. Whether it's in the Amazon, where they're slashing and burning to create pastures for livestock, that then is so woundly tied to the climate change problem, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, again, if we just work our way from the sort of, middle of the 20th century classic air pollution source, power station, steel mill burning coal, not only are you producing sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides and particulate matter, but you're also producing CO2 at that time. And we know that, and we're living with that legacy right now. Um, when you think of more modern sources, as I was referring to, as we transition away from coal and our large industrial sources are maybe less integral to the total air pollution problem, you're still talking about transportation with fossil fuels. If you're burning fossil fuels, you're making air pollution and you're making CO2. Now, the ratios of those as you travel a vehicle mile are changing, but they're still tightly wound together. If you then get into deforestation and agriculture, you're facing the same problem. You're producing methane, you're producing CO2 as you change the land use and land cover. It might be exacerbated by burning some of the land cover. The hoofs and the tilling are producing air pollution at the same time. These things are, as you said, sort of intrinsically linked. Um, One additional piece that we've been focusing a lot on lately are wildland fires. And we're focusing on the US, but in principle, this point is relevant globally. When you have a fire, the biomass that burns, just like in your case of uh, burning vegetation to clear for agricultural purposes, you're releasing a whole bunch of carbon, you're releasing other organic compounds, you're making particulate matter. So there's a big air pollution effect. There's a big CO2 effect. But the interesting thing from a research point of view, the unfortunate thing from a human effect point of view is CO2 and climate change are actually raising risks of not only wildfire generally, but catastrophic wildfires. And so the feedback is one that climate change increases risks through drought, through increased temperature. That in turn increases the incidence of fire, the amount of smoke, the amount of pollution, the amount of CO2 being kicked up by land use change, and it's just a vicious cycle. And our research is showing that the air pollution effects from fire are really, really getting significant, at least in the US.
You mentioned that cycle, and I see that right now. I'm in Wales in the UK, and at one point we're the biggest exporters of coal in the world. Like we talk about who is currently pumping out the most greenhouse gases, and at one point that was us in this country. We've got such a heritage of coal mining. My bamper was a coal miner. So my granddad, he was born in 1919, worked down the mines from when he was 13, and we've got this heritage of coal mining. And now, over the last couple of years, we are seeing more wildfires here in rainy Wales than we ever have before. They keep coming back and back, and I just mapped a like 50-acre wildfire in a really, really rainy country. So that cycle of my bumper working down the pits, exporting coal mines, and now come right around to these wildfires that we never used to have, and we're just getting so many more of.
Yeah, and I mean, this raises the broader point of how environmental change is just tightly linked to social and economic change, right? I mean, in the US, we have a similar, maybe if not as dramatic phenomenon in terms of loss of employment in fossil fuel extraction industries. Right now, in particular, it's more coal than oil and gas, and that creates dislocation. But the economic benefits from coal-fired power plant closures are happening in those locations as well. And so, it's a very hard communication exercise to convey that the environmental and public health benefits are appreciable when a community is losing jobs and losing income and in distress. But nonetheless, it's real. And so a policymaker or activist groups or some stakeholder really needs to make that connection so that at least some of that loss can be countered by the environmental benefits that comes with these transitions.
And that's one of the things that we missed out on here was, our government saying these are the new things that you're going to be doing. This is a new way of doing things. And around the world, I am slightly optimistic when it comes to new types of energy generation. And in places around the world, they completely skipped landlines and went straight to mobile phones.
Right.
So part of me wonders whether we're going to parts of the world are going to be skipping, because we've had our industrial age. Both the UK and the US, we were there at the start.
Yeah.
But new countries now in the last 20, 30 years are just coming into their industrial age. So will they skip the fossil fuel part of it
Right.
and just go straight to renewable energies?
Right. So there's 2 points to make here. One is in some parts of the developing world, and in particular, I'm thinking about India. Recent data suggests that on a levelized cost of energy basis, it's cheaper to produce electricity with than coal, and that's a
Okay.
remarkably it's remarkable, right? I'll just say that, and it speaks to the technological progress in terms of the ability to turn sunlight into power in a relatively cheap way. That's just stunning that we are there in so fast a time relative to where we were 10 or 15 years ago. So that's one point, is that market forces are going to allow that transition, leapfrogging fossils to occur in places where that is true. But the other point to make is maybe a little bit more subtle, and that is, um, you know, broadly speaking, economies developed on a fossil path because we perceived that it was cheaper. We perceived that it was, inexpensive to take peat or charcoal or coal and to heat our homes and to power industry in that particular way. As an economist, I would contend that that cheapness is an illusion. And it's an illusion in the sense that the effects that we're talking about, right, whether it's wildfires or direct human health effects from combustion or disruption of ocean currents, et cetera, those costs are real and they're monetary. But the person or firm that's relying on those fossil fuels to make energy, to turn a turbine or heat a house, they're not paying attention to those costs because they're externalized. Other people bear them. And so when we think about the argument that some developing countries make, that is, you all, meaning developed countries, got to develop along this really cheap path at first, we should get to do that too. I contend that's actually not the cheap path. It's a path that has very, very large costs that we're dealing with now, both on climate and air pollution. And we need interventions, either information interventions or direct policy interventions or pricing interventions to make that apparent, right? To get the prices right so that firms and individuals are actually pursuing the socially cheapest path as they develop.
And I think that's, one of the problems when it comes to how we put air pollution or how we create air pollution is that it is this unseen thing, right? Like, I have this argument about nuclear energy all the time. And people say about Chernobyl and Fukushima and how
Right.
many lives the Chernobyl disaster has taken, which is too many. But at the same time, like the amount of lives taken per year via air pollution compared to the amount of lives taken by a disaster like Chernobyl, like almost no one dies per year with nuclear energy
Right.
generation. I don't even know the current number for air pollution, but it's not small.
Yeah. So in the US, that number currently is somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people every year. Premature
Jeez.
deaths. These are not deaths that show up with a death certificate that says air pollution. It'll say, lung cancer. It'll say respiratory disease. It'll say cardiovascular disease. But we know these are associated exposures to air pollution. So
Wow.
the thing
And that's
about
in a
nuclear,
developed country.
that's in a developed country, right? Let alone
Yeah.
estimates in India or China where pollution levels are higher, population levels are higher, healthcare systems are less developed. It's a staggering toll. Um, but as you said, when we think about risks that come from nuclear power, they have a sort of visceral scariness to them that air pollution just doesn't. And we, as
Mm.
humans and as decision makers, are not very good at ascertaining risk, capitalizing risk into our decision making processes, weighing latency and risk. And that's why we need pricing schemes or policies to try to inform decisions as they involve environmental risk, because as individual decision makers, we're terrible at this.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned decision makers, and a lot of the athletes that will listen to these podcasts and watch these videos will have gone to these places where, and I've gone to these places where I'm always humbled when I come back home of like how developed even Wales is. And we don't have, we're not the richest country in the world, but we've got good infrastructure here. And when you go to these countries, like there was pictures of Kathmandu during COVID, where everyone stopped driving around and the
Right.
smog started to go away. You could see Everest from there, for example. Um, these athletes would have gone to these countries and might want to do something, but can we do anything as individual people? We're not the decision makers. Is there anything we can actually do?
Right. I mean, there's a couple answers. One, so much of the local environmental outcomes in developing countries depends on institutions, right? And so it does take mature institutions, mature in the sense of having developed, having legal structures, having enforcement mechanisms. It does take those institutions to set up and implement rules, even if they're decentralized, like pricing, carbon pricing, or local pollution pricing rules. It takes consequences, and consequences require institutions to have those bind up here. So that's not really an individual piece. That's more of a broad-based country-to-country piece.
Yeah.
I've become more convinced that financial markets are an important ingredient here. And I say that for a couple reasons. One, when an investment, or rather an asset manager like BlackRock, comes out and says, we are going to manage the funds that we have um, under our purview according to ESG criteria, that's a big enough firm with a big
Mm.
enough pool of capital that's going to move the needle, right? The Exxons of the world, the Dow Chemicals of the world are going to hear that and say, oh, well, wait a minute, that matter now in a new way. And I raise this because we all know that supply chains reach into various parts of the developing world. And so if firms know that their actions are being paid attention to by actors like BlackRock, they're going to change their behavior. It depends on information getting to BlackRock, but that's part of what I work on, and part of what others work on throughout the world, is trying to improve the extent to which we know what's going on up the supply chains. So at the individual level, we can make choices about what we do with our retirement accounts, our 401ks, our consumption habits. Very simple things like, who do I buy my socks from? Do I buy a North Face shirt? Do I buy a Patagonia jacket? Do I do this? Do I do that? According to informed decisions that honestly ultimately go back to some of the modeling that we were talking about initially. When we try to figure out what a factory in Kathmandu does to local public health, we need economics, we need public health studies, we need environmental engineering, we need to put it all together. So I think there are things that we can do if we take the time to pay attention, to process the news and information that BlackRock might give us, the news media might give us, or just our own research might give us.
And I suppose, when we're looking at those firms, and industry is a big part of the air pollution total numbers. When we're looking at generating outdoor gear, and I am really excited about the future of outdoor gear and what the companies are doing. There's a lot of companies who are trying to solve the plastic problem and come away from plastic. I see less in the outdoor industry about how they're going to try and get away from the air pollution problem, like how much energy it takes to create a jacket or how much energy it creates to take a pair of skis, for example. So I'd love to see more transparency from the outdoor industry on how much energy we generating or using per year, and what's that doing to the environment around the factories that we're using.
Boy, I couldn't agree more. Very recent developments in the Biden administration in the US, and I only mention this because that's what I'm most aware of, suggest that ESG disclosure in a uniform, rigorous fashion is getting closer to being mandatory. And on some level, that's just disclosure. It's not saying you can only emit this or you can only produce that or limit your energy use. But what we know from the research is that just shining a light on firms' decision-making processes, right? Like how much CO2 they produce per jacket or per dollar of gross revenue, changes how they behave, even without the binding rules.
Wow.
This is in my research, it's in prior research. And so that step is important from the perspective of the point you just made, which is the concerned recreationist wants to know and make decisions accordingly, and that's super important. The other perspective is once a firm knows that the world is watching or can watch, or BlackRock can actually get the data and compare the North Face to Patagonia, they change how they behave because they're implicitly competing on a new level, on a new dimension. So I am a big proponent of let's just get the information out and make that first step before we worry about policy rules and international relations, etc.
And I think it'll make us all more informed as citizens as well. And, we're very loyal to our brands. And I love that, for the brands that I really like are starting to look at net zero by 2030 and the likes. It's in all our interests, including the outdoor manufacturers, to start making progress towards that point from the economics, from the engineering, and from the public policy as well. Nick, thank you so much for spending so much time with us. I'm always impressed with scientists who are just so willing to talk about their research and give up their time to make us all a bit more informed.
You bet. My pleasure, Hugh. Thank you.